This
is TLV1.
TLV1 radio.
Great mixture.
I like Tel Aviv.
This is still V1.
This is
Tel Aviv is a beautiful city.
Great city, great radio.
TLV1.
This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I am your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers, researchers, documentary filmmakers and other people of all trades and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. And on our show today, our first guest will be Dr. Nurit Cohen Levinovsky. She's a historian who now has a new book out. It's entitled Jewish Refugees During the War of Independence. It was published in Hebrew. And it turns out that not only Palestinians became refugees in the thousands during the 1948 war, but also Jews from all over the country. Our second guest will be Michael Satlow. He's a religious studies and Judaic studies professor at Brown University in the United States and author of the recently published How the Bible Became Holy. He will shed some light on the selection and canonization processes over the centuries that brought the Bible to the special status that it now holds. It turns out that the finger of God wasn't always as deeply involved as we may think. This is our show for today. Do stay with us. We'll be back right after this.
Color in your cheeks. Do you ever get that feel that you can't shift, the tide that sticks around like summits in your teeth? Are there some aces up your sleeve? Have you no idea that you're in deep? I dreamt about you nearly every night this week. How many secrets can you keep? There's this tune I found that makes me think of you somehow, and I play it on repeat until I fall asleep, spilling drinks on my settee. Do I wanna know if this feeling flows both ways? Sad to see you go. Sorta hoping that you'd stay. That the nights were mainly made for saying things that you can't say tomorrow day. Crawling back to you. Never thought of calling when you're at you, 'cause I always do. Maybe I'm too busy being lost to fall for somebody new. Now I thought it through, crawling back to you. So have you got the goods? Been wondering if your heart's still open, and if so, I wanna know what time it should. Simmer down and poker up. I'm sorry to interrupt, it's just I'm constantly on the cusp. I've tried been to kiss you. I don't know if you feel the same as I do, but we could be together if you wanted to. I wanna know if this feeling flows both ways. Sad to see you go. Was sorta hoping that you'd stay. Didn't we both know that the nights were mainly made for saying things that you can't say tomorrow day? Crawling back to you. Never thought of calling when
This is TLV1, broadcasting from Tel Aviv on TLV1.fm, and you're listening to the Tel Aviv Review. I am Gilad Halpern. Welcome back. I am now joined here in the studio by Dr. Nurit Cohen Levinovsky. She's a historian whose new book, Jewish Refugees During the War of Independence, has just been published in Hebrew and hopefully soon in English. It tackles a rather obscure episode in the Jewish-Arab War of 1948 that eventually led to the creation of the State of Israel. We call it here in Israel the War of Independence. Hello, Nurit, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, and hello to the listeners.
So whenever we talk about refugees of the 1948 war, it is immediately associated with the Palestinian refugees, the Nakba, etc., because it is an ongoing question that is still relevant today. But as it turns out from your study, there were quite a few Jewish refugees. So my question to you is a bit, I want to get a better grasp of who they were, how many were there, where did they come from, where did they go, and why?
Okay, so we're really talking about a large phenomena in the War of Independence of Israel in 1948. It involved around 60,000 people all around the country. I mean, north of Israel, center of Israel, south of Israel.
So it is more than 10% of the Jewish population in Israel at the time.
Around 10%. And it involved all forms of settlements in Israel of 1948. I mean, cities, moshavot, moshavim, kibbutzim, all around the country and all.
So not just the peripheral places like if far north or perhaps in the West Bank that later turned to be a Jordanian territory or far south,
exactly.
Even in the very center of the Yishuv.
Tel Aviv, for example. Tel Aviv, for example, we are talking about 80,000 people that had to leave their houses because of bombarding or air raids from Egypt. And they left their houses in the neighborhoods that were close to Jaffa and moved to more secure neighbors in inner Tel Aviv.
But if we're talking about air raids, Egyptian planes bombarding Tel Aviv, how does it make a difference?
The air bombs started only after May 15th. And the war started, as we know, just after...
Yeah, because there were two phases to the war. Just to put it in context, the civil war of Palestine between the Jews and the Palestinians within still British-ruled Palestine from November 1947 until the 15th of May 1948, when the British still ruled the country. And after the British left, the war went on and new players became involved, the Arab countries around Israel, and it became a more international, multilateral
and new
conflict.
kinds of weapons started to go into use, including airplanes. We're talking about a phase of the war that people in the major cities of Israel were in danger because of sniper shootings and cannons and etc. And they fled back into the cities, and they took over places wherever they could find shelter, yards or
attics.
Attics, right? Yeah. Wherever they could find shelter, and they stayed there for months, and some of them even years. So,
did anyone in the government cater to them? Was there like an overall policy of how to deal with the refugees and maybe even take care of their evacuation?
There was a serious effort from the Israeli government that was established after the establishment of the State of Israel, but even before that, the temporary government and other national organizations tried to assist, and in a way they did assist the refugees in the cities and outside the cities, but it was a very limited help because there were limits to the yishuv, to the
resources,
to the resources of the Jewish.
But there was also an ideological question here, wasn't there? Right, because for many people who were pioneers, whose main goal was to settle the land, evacuation equals defeat.
Was out of the question. And the policy before the war began was absolute denial of the remote possibility that people will evacuate their settlements, including children and women. The idea was that if women and children are in the settlement during the fight, the fighters had bigger incentive to defend the settlement, and that is something that cannot be even thought about. And when the actual fighting started, there was a shift, a total shift of the policy, and a new understanding that
that it's the humane thing to do,
right? That's even from a military perspective, that's the right thing to do, because the children and women are not helping; they are actually disturbing the war effort.
Well, did it also come from? Was it like a bottom-up sort of pressure from the parents, the mothers themselves, telling the authorities, just get us out of here?
You can say it was bottom-up because it wasn't the parents. Because if we're talking about the period that before the war, there were discussions, for example, in many kibbutzim, are we going to evacuate our women and children when the fighting will start? And the settlements themselves said, we're not going to do that. We are not talking about a policy that was forced upon the civilians. That was something they deeply believed in themselves. So when the moment came and there had to be a change, it was a bottom-up change, but it was a more complex change. We can't talk about leadership and the civilians fighting each other in that matter.
Was it the same policy towards settlements that were outside the prospective borders of the Jewish state according to the partition plan? Because there were not many, but a few Jewish settlements in the West Bank and in some places. Even I think there was even one in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, right? And
even around Jerusalem. I mean, Kiryat Anavim and Ma'ale HaChamisha. Those were kibbutzim.
Today is in Israel proper, but at the time weren't supposed to be part of the Jewish state.
Right.
So was there a different policy towards them, or was it the same one?
It was the same one, but in other aspects, it was a more complex question for them. And they wanted to make sure all along that they are treated the same. But if you check it practically, the policy and the behavior was the same.
Can you tell us a bit about those, from a micro perspective, about the kibbutzim or the settlements around Jerusalem or in the West Bank, and how did they perceive their predicament? They were really the first line of defense when it came to the Jordanian army, which was by far the most powerful army involved, Arab army involved.
The most powerful army was the Egyptian army, and there wasn't in the West Bank, the area that we call today the West Bank. There weren't Jewish settlements at that time, but there were many Jewish settlements that were situated in the frontiers lines, and they really were essential to the defense of the young Jewish state, and in more than one way they established the borders. Just being there and fighting for their homes made it possible to draw the lines of the borders around.
But there were a few settlements that were permanently evacuated. I think about Kfar Etzion and Bet Arava and other places that are in the West Bank.
Of course.
So,
okay.
No, I'm trying to think about to try and maybe draw a line here between those settlements that, I don't know if it's the right way to put it, but fought to the death, and others that decided, okay, now it's time to evacuate because it's just not sustainable.
What I'm trying to prove in my book is that the decision to evacuate women and children from their places are not a sign of weakness, and the evacuation is not a sign for a total evacuation. It is quite the opposite, actually. Because when you evacuate women and children, you are saying, I'm going to stay here and fight, maybe to fight to the death, okay? So what I'm trying to say is that the wrong policy of the Yishuv in 1948, and we still hear it till this day when in the last war in Gaza, Tzuk Eitan, there were voices that were saying, you can't evacuate the women and children. That's the first sign of weakness, and afterwards everything is going to fall apart. And I'm trying to prove that it was wrong in 1948, and it's wrong
still wrong today.
Exactly.
Right. I'd like to hear now about how in relation to the Palestinian question that was still remains open-ended, how was the Jewish refugee problem, how was it resolved?
It was resolved easily after the Jewish side won the war. It turned out that the Jewish problem of refugees is temporary, and the Jewish refugees could return to their homes, while as the Palestinians lost the war and couldn't go back to their homes, and that's still one of the core issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict till this day.
Was it an absolutely seamless resolution of the Jewish refugee problem? Were they not in need of some, welfare assistance afterwards? Was it just a temporary phase in their lives? That it, even on a psychological level, did it leave any traumas with them? I mean, because you're not just looking from the macro perspective, you're also taking a very micro perspective about the lives and the thoughts of these people, these individuals.
First, there were Jewish refugees that were getting help even from international organizations such as the Red Cross after the war was ended. For example, Jewish refugees from the old city of Jerusalem and Jewish refugees from Bet Arava, a kibbutz near the Dead Sea. So there were Jewish refugees that lost their houses for good, unless they were getting help from the Israeli government and some international organizations, would probably suffer a long time after the war was over.
Did the Jewish establishment ever recognize them as refugees who require certain status?
I'm trying to deal with that question in my book because, as we discussed in the last few minutes, it was a large phenomenon and large numbers of people, and yet it was forgotten from the Israeli collective memory. And I'm trying to answer the question why. And one of the answers is that the Jewish establishment didn't felt comfortable with the fact there were Jews that had to leave their houses during the war, because it was still considered a sign of weakness. And in comparison to the Arab side, it was easier for them to say, well, we proved our attitude towards the land, and we proved who is worthy of the land because we didn't escape, we didn't run away. So that was one of the reasons that the whole story was forgotten. And just to answer the question you asked me before, as far as the psychological side of the story and the signs of trauma, I can say that there are still, till this day, there are people that in some way feel the evacuation turned their lives upside down and left marks on their souls growing up in Israel. And there are still mothers, 90 years old mothers that had guilt complex towards their children. They felt like they abandoned them and they didn't treat them right. And so there are still
some scars. Also for the Jews, it's an ongoing question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Nurit Cohen Levinovsky, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it here. You're a historian who specializes in Jewish refugees during the War of Independence, the War of 1948. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you, Gilad.
You're listening to the Tel Aviv Review here on TLV1. I am Gilad Halpern. I'm now joined here in a beautiful Jerusalem courtyard by Michael Satlow. He's a professor of religious studies and Judaic studies at Brown University in the United States. He's the author of numerous books, including most recently How the Bible Became Holy. It was published a few months ago by Yale University Press. Hello, Michael, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start with a question that you might find a bit irritating, but it would be a good starting point for our discussion. Who wrote the Bible?
Now that, Gilad, is a fascinating question. The Bible as a book evolved over a long period of time. So I think the best way to understand the Bible, at least and I'm talking in academic terms, is as an anthology of writings that date from probably the 10th or 9th century BCE up until the second century BCE. So who wrote the Bible doesn't really have an easy answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how did it become this one single textual unit if it was written over such a long period and by, I'm assuming, so many people? And at a time when archiving material was virtually impossible.
Right. So that the collection of these works into a single volume, if you will, although they would have been different scrolls at that time, that took a significant amount of time. So you actually don't have the notion of kind of a real canon, if you will, of the Bible. Until relatively late, more or less into the rabbinic period, maybe a little bit earlier, do you begin to get the notion that these things actually work all together. The question of how they actually gained authority for people, that's to me is somewhat a more interesting question.
But even before we get to that, even a more basic question, during the rabbinic period, well into the Common Era, how were they able to pull out texts that were written almost a millennia before?
Well, remember, each one of these texts, right, there was we have a codex, and this is actually an important thing to remember in terms of technology. So a codex is a book as we know it, right? You turn the pages and you can get the whole Bible into a single volume. Back then you had scrolls. So the idea, and anybody who's familiar with a Torah scroll knows that scroll is fairly lengthy, it's sometimes heavy, it's hard to use, and it's only 5 books out of the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible. So in terms of, in the rabbinic period, or any time really until the very early Middle Ages for Jews, they would not have had a whole copy of the Bible. They would have only had access to various scrolls, and that access, of course, would depend on their own literacy levels.
Mm-hmm. And the canonization process, let's get to the bottom of it. I mean, that's, again, the more substantial process. Can you tell us a bit about, how it was done, according to what parameters, and by whom?
Right. So the canonization process, I prefer to think of as kind of a process of the giving of authority to these texts, many of which are somewhat strange. So that giving of authority takes place at different levels at different times. So, the idea that there is a central synod, for example, that says, okay, suddenly these texts are now, we consider them holy, and we consider these holy texts closed. We don't have anything like that in Jewish history. There's an idea that something like that happened at Yavna. But I think most scholars today reject that idea. Mm-hmm. So instead, what you have is a process in which some of these texts gradually gained authority among certain groups of people, and that authority, those texts, that kept growing over time among different groups. So by the time of the rabbis, for example, in the 3rd century CE, you had the texts of the Hebrew Bible, our present texts, are more or less considered to be authoritative. Mm-hmm. But there wasn't a good, clear notion that there couldn't be more texts or somewhat different texts. As, for example, Ben Sira is sometimes quoted in the Talmud as being an authoritative text, as if some people almost considered it biblical. Maybe they did. You don't really get closure and closure not only of the books that go into the Bible, but also the text itself, I would say until Maimonides, who then says not only do we have these particular books, but it's this one particular text in the Aleppo Codex. And then you really have true closure.
So what you're saying is basically that upon the writing, and perhaps many years and centuries thereafter, those texts weren't holy at all, and how the Bible became holy, the question, or when did the Bible become holy, was a much, much later question.
Well, I think that in terms of them getting authority, part of that authority was granting them this kind of status of holiness. So that did come relatively early. When you get a text that is considered to be from the Word of God, and it's considered that way, that is a kind of an imprinter of holiness, if you will. So when the rabbis are, for example, using these texts to create Jewish law, to create all kinds of other things, engaging them, they're certainly considering these texts as holy. Now, then that process went on a bit earlier as well.
Did they believe, as many people do today, that these were the words of God verbatim?
Well, it's a good question. I think in the whole they did, or they had some kind of notion like that. Right? In that they could look at a text and say, that there is what might be called an omni-significance to these texts, that the text as inspired or given by God has real normative as legal ramifications for the way people live their lives.
Every time I personally think about that period of late antiquity and perhaps the early Common Era, my immediate reference is, of course, the Monty Python film The Life of Brian. And there's a scene there that I like very much. It's one of the funniest, that Brian, of course, telling the story of, a spoof of the story of Jesus, for those who haven't seen the film and should do that right away, is wrongly believed to be the Messiah, but by a growing number of people who follow him wherever he goes. And then he turns to them and say, "Leave me alone, I'm not the Messiah." And one turns up and says, "Yes, you are, I've followed a few, so I should know." And my question to you is, according to your research, has there been a similar thing with the text of, this randomness of giving the text authority? Am I making myself clear?
Yes. No. I mean, and it's actually an interesting and provocative analogy, I would say. So there is, in a sense, yes. I think that there is a certain kind of randomness. Why is one text authoritative? Why does one text become authoritative and not another? We have many texts from that period, many of which claim to be authoritative. That is, they make the self-claim. So you take the book of Jubilees from the Second Temple period, for example. It claims to be authoritative, but that doesn't make it into our Bible. You have the book of Ben Sira, for example, or Ecclesiasticus, doesn't make it into our Bible, but the book of Kohelet or Ecclesiastes does. Now, why would that happen? Especially if you look, Ben Sira actually seems much more pious than the author of Kohelet. So those are very difficult questions.
What is the answer? What is the answer?
The scholars don't have a good answer to, in terms of whether there's a rhyme or there's a reason behind some of the ways in which texts gain authority.
Do you have an hypothesis?
It depends on particular texts. I think at some point...
Ben Sira, for example.
So Ben Sira, why does Ben Sira not make it in? Perhaps because it is attributed, by name to somebody who lived too late to be considered authoritative. If it would happen to have been attributed to Shlomo HaMelech, then maybe it could have made it in, right? Those attributions are not necessarily true. So, for example, if we look at some of the Psalms, a lot of the Psalms are Mizmor LeDavid. They're Psalms for David, or attributed to David. Most scholars don't think that David actually wrote these Psalms. At some point, they get the attribution, and then given the attribution, they make it in somehow. They're seen as authoritative. The other point is that once a text is seen as authoritative by some people, right? Let's say you think one group thinks an earlier text is authoritative. They treat it as authoritative. Then a later group sees that second text as authoritative. It has to accept the authority of the base text.
I'm more interested in those who weren't considered authoritative, because it would amount to an act of horrible heresy, wouldn't it?
Well, that would, right. So on the part of the people who are not seeing those texts as authoritative, that's exactly how I think people in antiquity saw each other. I mean, that is, there were groups of Jews who said, well, you don't take my books as authoritative? Why would you not do that? That is, in fact, heretical, and back and forth. And, in fact, there's great debate. In the end, what we have is the result of the winners of that debate.
But still, did you find any evidence of perhaps the trials and tribulations of some scholars who were against considering one text as authoritative? You know, grappling with this sense of heresy.
A little bit. You see it a little bit in rabbinic literature, but not very much. And some of that.
How do you explain that? Or at least I'm just...
You don't have it.
Yeah.
There's so much we don't have.
Yeah.
That's how I explain it.
Perhaps.
The fact is that is simply a state of the evidence. Right? So we have 5-10% of what's produced in antiquity. And that's a highly curated and sometimes somewhat arbitrary collection of what was produced. And sometimes we get lucky, like with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we get some more evidence. So... in the end, we just don't have the evidence for it. That's how I would explain that.
That's a good excuse. You say in your book that its novelty is that it takes a historical rather than a literary perspective, which is the literary perspective is what other scholars had been taking up until now. Can you elaborate on this a bit? What do you exactly mean by that?
So what I wanted to do in the book is to kind of tell the story of the Bible as a social history. So I'm looking at people, right, as a narrative of what it is that actual people do rather than what a text does. A lot of times in our field we talk about the texts and what the texts do. Of course, texts don't do anything. They sit on a shelf until somebody actually comes and reads them, gives them authority and whatnot. So what I try to do here is really tell a story, a narrative, that stretches from the 10th century BCE to the 3rd century CE about how these texts actually functioned in people's lives.
And?
Well, and that, again, that's a So that story, what I try to show in the book is that there's... a real kind of, well, both an evolution and a sense of randomness and arbitrariness to the way the text functioned. So some of the text, what I try to do is to talk about 3 kinds of authority that these texts have. One kind is a kind of literary authority or cultural authority. That is, a text might be seen as something like the great novels that we read growing up as part of our school education, right? That we see as authoritative, but not really authoritative in any kind of legal or normative sense. The other kind of authority is kind of oracular, and these are the messages from God mainly about the future. And the third kind of authority is this normative or legal authority. That I think is what most people think about when they think about the authority of the Bible. That last kind of authority, I think, came relatively late for most people. Not everybody, but most people. Certainly by the time of the rabbis, but not a whole lot before that. The other kinds of authority, literary and oracular, they function in different ways among different groups of Jews in antiquity.
And I'd like to ask you perhaps to take a more comparative outlook. First, with the onset of Christianity, do we see similar patterns of, the gaining and giving authority to texts in Christianity in Judaism in the early years? And secondly, do you see similar patterns also in religions that didn't gain the status that Judaism and Christianity have today, and perhaps were, I don't know, even lost partially or completely over the years?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and I think the answer is both. Is basically yes. So among early Christians, It's a much more condensed period of time, but you see a real fight about whether texts have authority, and if so, what kind of authority texts have. Now, this gets to this kind of wider issue, and this, I think, is more relevant also for the other religions that you mentioned, which is the tension between textual authority, right? We look at a book to see what we're doing, and what might be called mimetic authority that we do things because our ancestors and parents did them. So when those things collide, what do you rely on? Mm-hmm. Do you rely on the text, or do you rely on tradition? And I think that really is a major theme of my book, but I think it's something also that comes out in many other religious formations and in early Christianity.
Mm-hmm. All right, Professor Michael Satlow, I'm afraid this is all we have time for. Thank you so much for coming on the Tel Aviv Review.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That was the Tel Aviv Review for this week. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Leo Peleg and Adam Scher, the producers of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. In the meantime, don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and do not hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions to Gilad, Gilad, at tlv1.fm. See you again next week, and until then, goodbye.
fiction.